wanted to offer this for NYACCE, I, tried to make some tweaks so that I wouldn't run out of time, but, we have an hour, 15 minutes. So I'm going to do the best I can. So we just definitely got to get started right now. I am not a lecture-based presenter, if any of you have seen me before, so there will be plenty of opportunities for us to engage in conversation. In fact, the second slide that I have in my notes says, tell everybody that this is going to be a discussion. So there will definitely be plenty of opportunities and moments to possibly communicate with me in the form that you feel most comfortable with. I really try not to say the dreaded phrase of unmute yourself or type in the chat. I just can't take that phrase anymore. So I'm going to go with for you to communicate with me in whatever way you feel comfortable. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see that. I don't have the little yellow outline that tells me you can see that. So somebody just give me a thumbs up or let me know that you can.
Yes, we can see you. We can see you.
Okay, so this is why can't I get this student learning versus student thinking. So like the bulk of this workshop is really going to be about brain-based learning. So we're not going to be like solving a math problem or anything like that. But we are going to be looking at the brain-based learning from the perspective of someone who is learning and or teaching in a math class. So even if you're not necessarily someone who teaches numeracy and or math directly, the information that we're going to talk about and share is going to be helpful no matter what content you are teaching, because we're talking about how someone learns, but through the lens and context of learning and teaching numeracy and mathematics. So here are our objectives. We're going to deconstruct what learning is, think about our own thinking. So we're going to get kind of meta here, not metaverse, but metacognitive. We're going to get a little metacognitive. We're going to think about our own learning, strategies for math thinking and learning, and then instructional routines that promote the strategies. So I'm going to actually give you some strategies, and then we're going to look at some instructional routines that actually like promote these strategies. That way, I know if I'm trying to foster this strategy, if I use this instructional routine, it's going to really help foster that strategy. So again, this is going to be a discussion and less about problem solving. And there's going to be some instances in which I'm going to ask you to actually take some time to think about your own thinking, your own learning style. Because that's the best way to go at this test so that you can help your learners to understand how they learn and how they think as well. So here's the first tip. If you're taking notes, right? I want to make sure that everybody knows like, okay, well, what are the tips? Here they are, right? Here's the first one, set your intention. And that's what you should do with your learners. That's what we're going to do here. You have to actually set your intention to learn. So I'm going to ask a question. Has any of you ever taken a yoga class or meditated before? You can give me a thumbs up or type yes in the chat if you have. And if you have, in that class, most of the time, right, even if it was online, right, most of the time, the first thing the instructor says, okay, everybody, let's clear our minds. Let's set our intention for the next 45 minutes or 60 minutes. Let go of everything that was happening before, let go of all the things that you were going to do later, and just be present in the moment, right? It's all that, wonderful yogi stuff, right? But there's actually a reason that they do that, right? You actually have to set your mind to have the intention to learn. So there's a difference though, between setting a learning goal and setting your intention. And I have an example for you. Uh-oh, what just happened to my notes? I clicked the wrong thing. I have an example for you. So an example would be my intention for this session is to be present, to be mindful, and to engage in any of the small group discussions that we're going to have in class, right? That's my intention. My intention is for me to listen well to the people in my group today. My intention is for me to really focus on what the teacher is going to be talking about today. That would be like my intention, right? And I personally see intention as how I'm going to go about achieving my learning goal. So my learning goal might be, I want to learn how to understand fractions today. My intention is how I'm going to go about achieving my learning goal. So as you can see on the slide here, I gave you intention setting is a guiding principle that will help connect your actions to your values or goals. So whatever your goal is as a learner in this session today, I would like to ask you to think about your intention. So we're going to have to do this virtually, right? I normally actually ask people to actually write it down because there's something to writing out your intention, right? So if you have a little piece of paper next to you and you would like to write it down, feel free to do that. Or you can type it in the chat, or you can just think it to yourself, right? But I want you to take a moment, and I'm going to stop talking as well, to set your intention for the next, how long is the session? 65 minutes, right? What is your intention for the next 65 minutes? You can type it, you can share it, you can think it out loud, you can write it down. I'm actually going to do it too. Oh, I see some people are sharing. Okay. And again, try to remember that your learning goal is different than your intention. My intention is how I'm going to go about achieving my learning goal. One more moment in case someone needs time to think. It really does help to encourage students to write it down. I really like to just have them on Post-it, so it's not something that has to become permanent, you know, maybe even like on a whiteboard. Okay, let's intention set, right? Because there's a reason for that. You actually have to prime your brain. I spent a lot of time recently researching brain-based learning. This is one of the first things, along with the other tips I'm going to share, as far as how to what actually happens in the brain when learning takes place. And one of the first things is you actually have to prime your brain to begin to learn, right? You have to it's almost like starting the car. All right, warm up the car before you can go to the destination. So I'll share my intention, and if anybody else wants to share theirs, we see some in the chat there. I'll read a couple from there too. My intention is to stay focused during this presentation, to stay focused and to not have my brain wander to other concerns, which I'm sure all of you can relate to. Like lately, my brain is like running all the time. It's hard for me to sleep because I've got so many things that I'm thinking about, concerned about, dealing with. And whether I want to or not, my brain goes over there to that thing, my kids, my house, you know? So I'm like, nope, my intention is to stay focused and only think about the people that are in the room right here and what we're about to do. Karen says her intention is to be positive about learning something new. I like that. Someone else said, my intention is to be open to new ideas. My intention is to be engaged, right? So Danielle, I feel like you and I are the same page, right? To be engaged. And sometimes it's hard to do with Zoom, right? We get zoomed out. Okay, so hopefully everybody's primed their brains with their intention setting for today. So that's step one, as far as helping students get past that, why can't I get this? Because we've all seen that student in the room where it's just like, I just don't understand. I don't understand why I don't get this, why I don't remember this thing, why it seems like I can't connect this. I hear the things you're saying and it sounds like it makes sense, but I just don't get it. So setting intention for learning matters. It can positively affect how people will learn and how much they will learn. Not just what they will learn, but how much they will learn, because you have primed your brain and now your brain is ready to learn. So the second thing is retrieve and connect to previous knowledge, skills, memories, etc. So now this is like basic andragogy 101, right? Teaching adults. We know we're supposed to activate prior knowledge, right? And there's a reason we're supposed to do that. But this is that, but it's more than just that, right? It's more than just me like activating your prior knowledge of like helping you to remember what you know about decimals. That's helpful, but this is more than that. You want to retrieve and connect to previous knowledge, skills, and memories. In fact, I think the most valuable one here is memories. Memories, connecting to something in the brain. So what do I mean by that? I have an example. I've been for almost 9 months now, I've been actively learning another language. And of course, I had to choose the third hardest language for an English language learner to learn, according to America government, something for language linguistics or whatever. They say the three hardest languages for an English language learner, an English learner is Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. And I'm learning Korean. It's totally different. It's not even a Romanized language. So you have to first learn how to read. There's a lot of different pronunciations. The order of the sentences are different, right? Their sentences go subject, object, verb. So instead of saying, I like apples, I would say, I apples like, right? So that's really hard. Don't get me started when you have two verbs. I'm like, what? Where does the second verb go? So I've been working on learning that language for 9 months now, right? And there are some words where I'm like, I know I learned this word. And I feel my brain going like, oh, remember the word. And like, I feel like my brain is reaching for it and I cannot achieve it no matter what. And one of those words was the word for happy. No matter what I did, no matter how many times I tried to remember it, I had flashcards, I had apps, I just could not remember the word. And then my Korean language teacher, because I have a tutor, she spelled it out and she pronounced it. And when she pronounced it, I heard a word that was similar to something else that I knew. And the word for happy is hengaka. And it sounds like hanbok. And hanbok is like a traditional Korean wedding dress. And women wear that wedding dress, that traditional wedding dress to weddings, especially if they're the mother of the bride. And I'm like, oh, wait, it sounds like hanbok, which you wear at a wedding, and people are happy at a wedding. So, okay, so happy at a wedding. Okay, and I've never forgotten the word for happy since I was able to make that connection. And it wasn't just a connection to the idea of the dress. I actually pictured a memory of me watching a K-drama, right? Like a Korean TV show. And I can actually see the mom wearing the hanbok and she's sitting in the chair and she's smiling so big because she's so happy that her daughter is getting married. I connected to a memory and now I have learned that thing. I didn't just think about that thing. It wasn't in my short-term memory. It is now in my long-term memory. I now henceforth know how to say I am happy in Korean because I connected to a previous memory, skill, or idea. See, somebody type something in the chat, so I'm gonna pull what that is. Mnemonic device, that's also a way of like helping connect to something, right? So the second step after you prime your brain is to connect to something, right? The brain literally has to connect. So it's more than just like I was thinking. We're actually talking about your brain. I'm going to show you a picture of brain. It's actually, the neurons are actually reaching out to connect to another set of neurons. It's an actual biological thing that's happening. So let's talk about how we are learning. Why and how. So sometimes the issue of why a student in our class just doesn't get it is how they or we as their instructors go about their learning. So it's important for us as teachers, as well as for our learners, to understand how they learn, what's happening in their brains, as well as how they learn, like what works for them when they learn something. And I'm not just talking about learning style. So I'm not just talking about, oh, I'm a visual learner. I'm not talking just about your learning style. I'm talking about how you actually learn something. So let's look at what learning is and strategies for going about it. And I know you're going, well, Cynthia, learning styles is how you actually learn something. Here's an example. I know I'm a visual learner, but I also know that if you give me notes, like if I'm taking the notes, or if you give me a work, like a paper with notes, like sometimes teachers type out outlines, or even you give me a PowerPoint slide, right? Like we're at these conferences and people put all their work and words and stuff on a PowerPoint slide, and all of that text is all in the same color. I know I'm not going to retain and or take in that information. That has nothing to do with my learning style. That has to do with how I learn. I know about myself as a learner that I need the text to be in different colors and or structured differently. If it's all just like black ink, all like just down in one column, I'm not going to take it in. I know that about how I learn, which is one of the reasons why my slide decks are always so colorful. Or even if you look at any of my notebooks, my notes are always in different colors, because that's the only way I'm going to learn. I'm not going to learn if it's all black ink. I'm just not. So that's different than my learning style, right? It's connected a little bit to my learning style since I am a visual learner, but how I learn, like understanding how you learn, not necessarily the same as your learning style. And I'm going to give you all a chance to think about how you learn in a second. So this is actually a picture of your brain that's activated. This is actually a, what do you call it? MRI scan of someone who's actually involved in learning, right? So this is your brain on learning. And if you see, like, you've got a lot of things, you got a lot of synapses firing here. Also, you've got like these neural centers, and you see these like branches, these are neurons, right? So when you're about to start to learn, you've primed your brain, those neurons start to actually reach out, they start to branch out, and they're branching out looking to connect to another neural center, another bunch, another group. Hence, you have to connect their thinking to something else, to another memory, to another skill, to another image. And I strongly recommend memories, to be honest, because memories are really powerful, especially like a sense of smell. When I gave this workshop at COABE, someone gave a really good example. They're like, oh, when I teach miles per hour or unit rates, I always just picture being on vacation and how we ran out of gas on the side of the road, me and my family, and we happened to be standing in front of a 55 miles per hour sign, a speed limit sign. So anytime I think about unit rates, I pull up that memory of being on the side of the road and seeing the speed limit sign. So his brain was firing. He's like, doo-doo. He's like, oh, find that memory, connect. Yep, got it. Right. And now the brain's like, got it. Okay. Right. So it's actually more than just what we know about teaching. Activate prior knowledge. No, you're actually trying to get the neurons in the brain to do more than just fire. You're trying to get them to fire and then to reach out and connect to something else, which is why if you're trying to help someone learn and get beyond that I don't get it thing, one of the reasons they don't get it is because without that connection, the neurons are going to fire. Your brain is going to put it into short-term memory. And then throughout the day and even possibly at night, your brain goes through it. It thinks about all the stuff that's in your short-term memory and it goes, you don't need that, 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 and it dumps it. And that's why they come back to your class the next day and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Right? Similar to learning in pictures. Pictures are also a really good way to connect. Yes. Sense of smell, a past memory, a TV show, right? Connect to something. Anybody want to add to that? Because that was like a lot about our brain and, you know, a lot of me talking, which I don't enjoy. I love that you all are typing things in the chat, but you can also add something else, or if you want to share any other thoughts around this. Maybe you've done a little bit of research around neural brain-based learning. This is called neuroplasticity. You've probably heard that, right? Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to form and reorganize these connections, especially in response to learning. So your brain, your student's brain, has the ability to reorganize itself, to reform connections, to strengthen connections that are already there. Martell says, I've noticed that when I start teaching something, I end up asking them if they've seen a particular movie or TV show where it was referenced. That's you trying to help them make that connection. Those connections are important. And the sad part about it though is like, when we remember to do that, if that happens, we might be like 15 minutes into the lesson. So the first 14 minutes meant nothing to them. But when you help them to make that connection, now their brain's like, oh, okay, this is important because it's connected to something I've already decided was important, right? The brain actually does this thing where it dumps what's not needed or necessary. Dr. Joe Bowler, who I think is like my superhero in mathematics, she said, memories are strongest. This is why I kept saying, I think it's actually really good to connect to memories rather than other math stuff, right? Like, guys, you know, percents are like decimals, right? Like, that's not super helpful, right? It's actually more helpful when you connect to memories. She said memories are strongest and best when they access knowledge that is built in different parts of the brain. So outside of the classroom, the different part of the brain, that happy memory, that home cooked meal that mom made for you, that sad memory maybe where you got your first heartbreak or whatever. And maybe your first heartbreak was your girlfriend or boyfriend broke up with you after algebra 2 class and you had just finished learning systems of equations. And now whenever you think of systems of equations, your heart hurts because you remember that, right? Like that matters, right? The brain is connected with rich and multidimensional memories. Linda said it helps to keep in mind the VAKT rule. Learning can be visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. Those are your learning styles, yes. One more piece of research, because I wanted to show you this was not just like Cynthia thinking about it, right? I did a lot of research on this and I'm really, really interested lately in brain-based learning because I feel like I want to take the math teaching and learning that I do and that my teachers that I work with do to like the next level. And knowing how you learn is really what's going to get that, especially since I'm on this journey of learning a second language. Like I've never paid so much attention to how I've learned before in my life until I started trying to learn another language. I'm like, this is so hard. The only way I'm going to get this is for me to really understand what works for me and how I learn. This is actually why I don't use Duolingo. A lot of people love Duolingo. They ask me, you know, what app are you using when they find out I'm learning another language? And they're shocked when I say I'm not using Duolingo. I'm not using Duolingo for a reason. That reason is because it doesn't help me with the way that I learn. So it was a waste of my time and my money. I'm like, this is not how I learn. This is not helpful for me. Right? So helping a student to understand how they learn. Each time you learn something new and you practice it in your brain will either change the structure, so it will reorganize it and increase the number of synapses between those neurons, allowing them to send and receive information faster. I thought this one was important. Faster. That's how you get to fluency, right? Eventually, that pathway starts to become used more and more and more, and it fires those synapses faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. And that's how you can start to become fluent in anything, because your brain has got that connection and that tapping in and firing down to like split nanoseconds. That's what makes you fluent, right? So not only do you want to help them to make those connections and then to strengthen those connections, you also want to help those connections to go back and forth faster and faster and faster and faster. And that's what's going to get them to what's 7 times 8? 56. Not what's 7 times 8. Hold on. 56. A key difference between student thinking and student learning, right? Which is why you all are here. What's student learning versus student thinking? The key difference between student thinking and student learning is if we only do the thing once or twice without requiring to retrieve previous memories, no new meaningful connections will be made. And so for me, we thought a lot in math class, right? Has that ever happened to you before? That's what was my description, right? Like you taught a really good lesson. Not only do you think it was good, but your students said it was good. You saw the looks on their faces. They were getting it. They understood. They had discussions. They were deep in thought, right? They were thinking. That doesn't necessarily mean they were learning. Learning is when that connection permanently stays and the brain is not going to dump it and think that this was information that was not needed, right? It might be in the short-term memory, but the brain has to decide that it's of value and importance to put it into the long-term memory. When it goes into the long-term memory, that's actual learning, right? All of us have learned how to ride a bike. You might not have ridden a bike in the last 15 years, but if I put you on a bike in 10 seconds, you'll be riding it again because your brain put it over here into the long term. But if I were to ask you to, I don't know, solve a quadratic inequality or something, you might be like, hold on a second. Right? That's that long term, you're really working hard to retrieve that. I have to be able to apply what I learned to something useful. There you go, right? You're connecting it to something. Consequently, we can have a really rich, thoughtful math lesson that engages the students, but that doesn't necessarily mean that any connections were made. So that is like the key here. I'm going to give you 2 more strategies, but as far as like your takeaway, how do you know when a student is thinking versus learning? The key here is the connections. The brain has to take those neurons and connect them to other neural centers, to those other like bulges that you saw. Otherwise, the brain's going to reabsorb it. And all they did was think really hard. That's not to say you cannot learn from thinking. We're going to get there. It is important to recreate and repeat the connection continuously over a period of time. This is why I'm a big fan of instructional routines. And that's what we're going to talk about in the second half. Instructional routines really get after that. Instructional routines is you continuously and repeatedly plowing that road of that connection over and over and over, to the point where they're like, I don't want to do notice and wonder anymore. And notice and wonder is an instructional routine, right? I'm sure all of us have done it. That's why I paused there for you to smile, right? Like, okay, we won't do notice and wonder anymore, but let's just look at this problem and think about what we see instead of saying notice it. Tell me what you see, even though that's still notice. But as soon as I say that, their brain, it activates, because the brain's like, I know how to do that thing. I've plowed that over and over and over and over. So let's talk about you. Let's talk about you. How do you learn? There are different kinds of learning. So one way to learn is, yes, you can actually learn by thinking. Einstein did that a lot, his thought experiments. Leveraged thinking is a process for learning. It is a process for learning. Thinking and learning are not the same thing, but you can use thinking to learn something. Again, Einstein did that. He was notorious for his thought experiments, and that is how he got to certain conclusions. Another way to learn is experiential learning. That might be kind of what Lisa was saying, right? Experiential, like by engaging in the experience of doing the thing, I have now learned the thing. So that is another way that you could learn. I'm giving you different ways for you to learn, because it is important for you and your students to know what way of learning works best for them. Recall and recognition, that is also another way you could learn. I have an example here. So learning to recognize street signs, that would be like recall and recognition. But that is a different kind of learning as opposed to learning how to ride a bike or how to walk. Learning how to ride a bike or how to walk would be like experiential learning. But learning to recognize like the street sign, that's recall and recognition. Like, oh, I recognize that thing. Oh, I know what that is. I've seen that before. And the more you see that thing, the more you know that thing. That's actually one of the ways I have been trying to learn my language, is called comprehensible input. Like my brain, the more it sees that thing, the more it hears that word. When it sees that thing, then it knows that that thing is that word. So instead of me looking at an apple and my brain going apple, no, I want to look at the apple and my brain goes sagwa, right? Sagwa is how you say apple in Korean. Like that's through recall and recognition. I'm trying to recalibrate my brain to now see that red shaped round fruit and not think apple, but to see that red shaped round fruit and think sagwa, right? That's through like recall and recognition. Learning requires that we find out about new things or stretch our abilities in some ways. Martil said, I've noticed in my 6-year-old that if it's not meaningful to him, he doesn't remember it. Exactly. Because if it's not making that connection, then his brain's like, nope, dumps it. He doesn't find everything useful, so it gets dumped. His brain is at high optimization for prioritization, which actually happens to our learners, right? Remember, our learners are adults. They have like other things are taking up space in their brain. Like I said, my kids, my bills, all the things, right? Those people in your classroom have those same things. So, and then you're trying to squeeze in there adding fractions with unlike denominators. Their brain's like, dump, right? Unless you connect that adding fractions with unlike denominators to something else. And it doesn't have to be other math. That's what I'm trying to get across. In fact, when you try to connect it to other math, that's not as strong as connecting it to something else, a memory, an application, and then also helping your learners think about how they learn. Experience matters. Another way to get at learning is through experience. As we said, experiential learning. Learning is a reaction to the quality of the experience that you have. So even down to the learning environment, right? Those things cause memories. And then your students, like if you've ever had like a really great lesson and the learning environment in the room was just so on fire, like everybody was talking to each other, maybe you had a video, and then like 3 weeks later, you go back to teach something and one of your students is like, oh yeah, I remember. That was like, remember that lesson that we had? And like the student over there, like yelled at the student across the room and then we all laugh, right? Like that's that experience and their brain latched on to that experience. So also keep that in mind, right? The quality of the experience that they're having matters to the learning. All of those things matter. Like, honestly, I cannot remember a lot from pre-calc, right? Pre-calc, I took pre-calc honors in 11th grade. I cannot tell you that I remember all of the math that I learned, but what I can tell you that I learned, and it will be with me to this day, is the smell of the coffee on my math teacher's breath. It was to the point where I never wanted to raise my hand and have him to come over to stand next to me to answer my question because I knew I was going to have to smell the coffee on his breath. And I cannot take the smell of coffee. So whenever I think about pre-calculus, the first thing that pops up in my head is the smell of the coffee on my teacher's breath. That was the experience. That was my high school algebra class. Oh, look at all the other people. Oh God, we have such bad memories of our math teachers. That's one of the reasons I don't drink coffee. I'm not gonna lie, I hate coffee. I hate the smell of Starbucks. It all just makes me remember pre-calc. That's why I keep mints on my desk. I'm glad we all connect, right? I hope I just triggered some memories for some of you all. You guys are now going to remember stuff that happens in the next 30 minutes. What are our students going to remember about us? That's such a loaded question, Karen. It's such a loaded question. Hopefully what they remember is that they learned something in your class. I drink coffee every morning, so I hope I'm not that teacher. Uh-oh, Amy. You might want to check yourself. I never had the guts to say anything, but it just got to the point where I was like, I will figure this problem out myself. Or my boyfriend was in the class with me at the time. I would just ask my boyfriend to help me because I was like, do not call him over here. Okay, so experience matters. Let's look at your experiences for a second. Let's look at your own learning experiences. I'm going to drop a link in the chat box. It is to a Padlet. And this is the meta part. I want you to actually think about your own thinking. So I'm going to put it in the chat, but I'm also going to give you a chance to access it however you want, right? Like maybe you want to do this on your phone. If you want to do this on your phone, you can scan the QR code. That is the link on the slide deck. Maybe you want to type it in yourself, or you can click the link. So you got 3 different ways to get there. This is going to take you to a Padlet. And don't start yet because I need to explain to you what you're going to do on the Padlet. We're going to actually think about our own previous learning experiences. And I want us to take some time where I actually have it on here for us to do like 10 minutes on this. We're going to think about an academic learning experience as well as a non-academic learning experience. So I'm going to hop over to the Padlet where you all should be. Hopefully you're going to get there. And you're going to think about your own learning experiences. So I've actually put some examples for you. I want you to think about a non-academic as well as a learned math academic thing, right? This is a math session. So the non-academic thing, again, because I'm trying to trigger your brain as far as like thinking about thinking. And it might be too difficult to think about a math thing that you learned. So I gave you an example here. So the first thing you're going to do is describe the thing learned, right? So identify it. You don't have to put your name, but identify that you're talking about a non-academic thing. So the thing that I learned is how to make kimchi fried rice, right? Obviously, I'm learning Korean, so I've been really interested in the Korean culture. I didn't even know this, but my mom and dad lived in Korea for 3 years. And I was like, what? I didn't know this? My mom decided to bring it up when she found out I was learning Korean. She was like, we lived there for 3 years and I never learned that language. It's so hard. I'm like, wait, what? You lived there for 3 years? So yeah, I learned that too. So one academic thing, that non-academic thing that I learned was how to make kimchi fried rice. Now, how did I learn it? So describe the circumstances which the learning came about. Well, I watched a YouTube video and then I tried making it. But every time I tried to make it, I still had to go back to the YouTube video. That's how I know I hadn't learned it yet, right? Like I had to keep going back to the YouTube video. I'd be like, wait, how many tablespoons of butter? Wait, was I supposed to fry the garlic first and then put in the kimchi? Every time I'd have to go back to the YouTube video because I hadn't actually learned it yet. But eventually, over time, I was able to make it on my own and I no longer needed the YouTube video. Eventually, I was like, oh, wait, nope. I know you roast the kimchi first, then you put in the onion. How have I used it or developed it? So not just that you learn it now, because remember, it's about building on connections, building on other things that are already stored in your brain. So I've learned how to cook kimchi fried rice, but now how have I used or developed or built on it? I've now started to play around with other recipes and making it or making that recipe even more spicy or using different kinds of meat. So I've started playing around with it, as well as cooking like other kinds of foods, which is my outcomes of learning. What changes happened to me or did I experience? I started cooking other Korean dishes because now I'm starting to understand how these ingredients work. Like I understand what happens when I put kimchi into a dish, whether I've roasted it first or I haven't, or if I've let it sit long enough for it to turn sour if I haven't, or how spicy it will be when I use it if I chopped it a certain way. I started to learn other things and been able to use cook other dishes, right? That's the process of learning. So not just that I learned the thing, but now that I built on the thing that I learned, and now how do I use that to go to other things to learn other things? That's the process of learning. So I would like for you to think about that as well. And you're going to click the plus sign when you're going to start to, when you're ready to write your thing, right? So I want you to think about it academic as well as non-academic. And I gave you 2 examples here. My non-academics with the purples, you don't have to color them if you don't. I just did that to make it easier so you could recognize which of my examples were non-academic. And then I gave my academic one, the concept of slope as a constant rate of change. That was the thing that I learned. And then I learned it by engaging in a number of graphing and pattern growth activities, right? It was those activities of the pattern growth and things like that. That's what helped me to actually recognize constant rate of change. Up until that point, all I knew slope as was the change in Y compared to the change in X. I only had that one understanding of slope, but recognizing that it's the constant rate of change, that came after I started engaging and looking at patterns and the growth of the patterns, like the actual images and seeing like figure 1 is this and figure 2 is this and figure 3 is that. That's when I started to learn it. And then I was able to connect it. So I'm going to stop talking and give you all a chance. This is going to be really boring for the recording, Sarah. I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry, because there's going to be like silence to let people think about their own learning. And I would also recommend maybe doing something like this with your learners, because it's important to recognize what happens when you're learning, because that's how you start to understand what learning way works best for you. Notice I didn't say learning style. What learning way works best for you. Experiential thinking. What was the third one? Oh, recall and recognition. Like what way of learning works best for you. So take a moment. If you have questions or you can't get on the Padlet, let me know. Ooh, how to maintain my washing machine. That sounds interesting. I learned a lot about the people in co-ed. Somebody learned how to garden some kind of New Mexican peppers. And he learned it through a lot of failed crops. But now he's like, I have a garden full of more than just peppers, because that's how his experience grew. He learned the pepper thing, and now he's learned about soil and all those other things. So he's able to like garden other things. Some people learn how to make bread. A lot of people learn things during the pandemic, right? We learned how to make bread, homemade ice cream, how to decorate cakes. Nice. How to garden. Searched the internet and found several sites. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen because you guys don't need to see my screen. You're on the Padlet yourself. I took Wilton cake classes. Nice. See, now I want to Google what's Wilton cake classes. I feel like that's like a name brand thing, or is like that the town of Wilton? And so you took cake classes in the town of Wilton. Inquiring minds want to know. Unfortunately, because this is remote, it is going to be a little asynchronous, but after a few minutes, I will give us some chance for people to expound on what they wrote, they want to share, because sharing is caring. Scented body power to make them smell great. Okay, wait, where did that one come from? What's that one connected to? I added scented body power to make them smell great. Wait, what's them? I'm trying to find like what that one connects with. Searched the internet and found several sites. Okay, how to make dough ornaments. The how to make dough ornaments poster. I don't think I see your how did you learn it post. That's why I'm confused. Wow, you're now the instructor of the Wilton cake classes. That's for the dough ornaments with flour and salt. I learned it through researching website. Nice. I don't want you all to get stuck on the non-academic. That's what happened at COAPE. Everybody only did the non-academic and nobody wanted to think about the academic. So I'm going to make sure you have enough time to think about the academic. I did not know asparagus is a perennial. So now you develop your own style of baking cakes. So you could possibly be on that show on Netflix called Is It Cake? Are you on that level where you can make cakes into like sewing machines and stuff like that? That show's incredible. Those people are incredibly talented who make those cakes. Are you on that level, or you're just like, nah, I'm not there yet?
No, I'm not at that level.
Those people are so talented.
Although when people want you to make them a cake, they think you're at that level. They want like all this fancy stuff.
High expectations are the seeds of disappointment. I began to look for ways to use manipulatives and visual models to learn to teach other areas of mathematics. Right. See, I like that expansion of your experience as I followed the green one about conceptual understanding of dividing fractions, not KCF. Like, you get a heart for that one. I'm going to go through and heart that one, not KCF. Please, let's learn the concept of division of fractions, because that concept is applicable whether I'm dividing fractions or whole numbers. You divide, you're multiplying by the reciprocal. So dividing by 3 is the same as multiplying by 1/3. Origami flowers. Okay, wait, I want to go back to the beginnings to describe the thing. Okay, so you learned how to fold origami flowers and make a wreath. How did you learn it? You searched the internet. Sounds like. I made flowers for some of my friends. Oh, that's so nice. Somebody unmuted. Did the origami person unmute themselves and want to tell us about their origami journey?
Yeah, so this is Martial. I found this advertisement on Facebook at a local library that you could go and make your own origami flower thing, with put them on wreaths, and the picture was beautiful. I was like, oh, I want to learn how to do that, because they were using like old library books that they had cut up into squares for the paper, and they were just so cool. And I was like, only $5 and you get everything. Like, I don't have to like pay, you know, like I don't have to bring my own wreath or anything. So I was really excited about it. And I went and I learned it and I was like, oh, I love origami. And I was like, I didn't know you can make this kind of flower. And it was like a little bit of hot glue and a little bit of paper. And I made this really beautiful wreath and I was excited. And then I was like, I want to keep making these flowers. So I just kept making flowers at home. And then I just gave them away. And then I was like, you know, I want to make another wreath. And my husband goes, you know, we do have those vines that are hanging, that are like wrapped around that pole. So I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. So we like ripped the vines off, like these old dried up vines. We ripped them off the pole and he twisted them up and we like figured out how to make like a little wreath out of these old vines that we had. And I was like, oh my gosh, like we figured out how to recreate these wreaths.
and apparently using a different material, right? We learned about paper and okay, great. Like, so I'm hoping that this is like, I'm smiling from listening to you all and reading you all's experiences, because I'm hoping that you're starting to get the connection of where I'm going at. Right? We're talking about the experience matters. Like, look at your journey, right? How did you learn this? Like, none of you needed me to tell you that you learned the thing, right? None of you were questioning whether you learned the thing, right? If you notice that. And that's what happens with our students sometimes. They're questioning whether or not they've learned the thing. If you have to question if you've learned the thing, you haven't learned the thing, right? None of you needed me to tell you that you've learned this thing. You're like, no, I know how to do this thing. And not only do I know how to do this thing, I know how to do other things because I know how to do that thing. Think about math. I know how to do this thing because I know how to do that other thing. And here's how I know I've learned that other thing, right? It's important to think about what happens when you're learning. It's important to think about how you build on that thing that you've learned, AKA back to the beginning, the second one, connect to prior experiences, knowledge, skills, and or memories, and then grow from there, right? And then grow from there. And more than just doing it, I'm a really big fan and advocate, especially when I work with teachers and I talk to teachers of all content areas, of making what you do in your classroom and why you do it explicit. It shouldn't be a secret that only you as the teacher know. And the students are left guessing, why are we doing this thing? No, I'm going to tell you why. It's explicit. And I'm going to point out while we're doing it, look, this is where you are in your learning process. This is what's happening to you right now while you're learning. That way they start to take ownership of their learning, right? That's how they can get to the point where I was at the beginning when I said, I know for a fact that I cannot learn when there's all this text on the paper like that. I had ownership of that. I'm like, I know I can't learn this way, right? But I had to get to a point like of experience for me to know that. So if you're going to do this and recognize it, you should also make sure your students know that they're learning and when they're learning and what stage in the learning process they are. We set our intention, you're connecting. Remember, you just connected back to this other thing, right? So eventually they can start to recognize how they learn, what kind of learning style works for them. Not learning style, what method of learning, what strategy of learning, right? Again, learning styles are important. Visual, kinesthetic, all of that is important. But as far as how I learn, how I go about learning, that's just as important. That learning experience matters. Somebody typed in the chat. For some reason, a large majority of my students come in remembering how to cross multiply. It sticks with them from their previous math lesson. Yes, but unfortunately, they come in with a misconception that they think they could cross multiply fractions and they get that mixed up with cross multiplying proportions. That is so true to students. Students want to cross multiply everything. They want to cross multiply everything, right? Which is why I'm like, okay, wait, let's back that up. Let's go back to that connection and like rewire, right? Neuroplasticity says you have the ability to rewire, but to rewire them, you're going to have to give them something else to connect to. It can't just be like, no, you can't do that. That's only for fractions and proportions. What you just said, their brain goes dump. They're like, that meant nothing, dumb, right? So you can't just say, well, you can't do that. That's only for proportions and cross multiplication. And maybe even you go beyond that and you give them like examples. and pictures because you have visual learners. Their brain still is probably going to go dump because that connection in their brain is already really strong. The only way to restructure that connection, to reorganize that connection, is to give them something else for their brain to connect to rewire to, right? Beyond just like, you can't do that, or even superficial things. And I don't have the answer for that for the people in your class, which is why I said it's important for you as a teacher, as well as them to know how they learn. If the people in my room, I know that they are thought thinker, that they're thinking learners, then I'm going to give them like things to think about to help them go, their brain go, oh. But if I know that they are experiential learners, then I'm going to give them different experiences that they actually go through where they recognize that, oh, wait, no, I wasn't supposed to cross multiply. Like that doesn't make sense. I should have cross multiply, right? Like it's important to know how they learn. It's important for them to know how they learn. And maybe you give all the strategies and then it's up to the learner to recognize this one is the thing that's going to work for me. That ownership, that self-agency is so vital, especially for our adult learners, where I can make that decision. I'm like, nope, I don't need that. I don't need that. I don't need that. This is the one. This one right here, that's the one I want. I'm going to use that thing. That thing is the thing that's going to stick in my head. All right, so let's see if I can find any other academic. Does anybody want to share an academic one? We talked about origami, flowers, cake making. Can I get a shout out about an academic one, a math academic one? You guys don't know this about me, but I have the ability to wait to uncomfortable lengths of time. I have no problem waiting. I have a teenager. That's all I got to say. I'm like, I'll wait. Martil, she said, you too. Really? Nobody wants to share? Okay. I really want to wait longer, but I'm also aware that we have to end at 12:15. So you guys win this one. All right, I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen. But I hope this was helpful, at least for you, right? As a learner, for you to recognize your experience of how you learn something, right? And I don't know if you noticed in my examples, right? This is why I said learning style is connected to how you learn. I said at the beginning, I'm like, I know that I'm a visual learner. And if you looked at either one of my examples, how I went about, because the second thing was, how did you go about learning the thing? How I went about learning the thing, both of them involved visuals, right? The non-academic things that I watched a YouTube video, not I read a recipe, I watched a YouTube video. And my academic thing said I engaged in growth patterns of shapes and growth. So how I went about learning the thing did in fact involve my learning style. I just wanted to point that out. So I'm not saying that it's one or one without the other. I'm just pointing out the difference between, you have to go beyond just, well, my student knows that they're an audio learner, or my student knows they're a tactile learner. Okay, but now that they know that, how do they learn? How do they go about learning, right? What steps do they know they should take? What steps do they know that don't work for them for learning? That's the difference between thinking in your math class versus learning in your math class. That self-agency, that ownership. This is how I learn. Okay, let's keep it moving. Step number 3, not step number 3, tip number 3, build connections. Oh, we're going to totally run out of time. Build connections, which you're like, Cynthia, weren't we already saying that? No, before we're saying connect to those things. Now we're saying build them, right? So now that you've connected them, you have to strengthen it. You have to walk that path over and over and over. That's what paths are, right? The path through the woods, somebody walked it first. It wasn't a path just because they walked it one time. Someone else had to come and walk that same exact thing. And then someone else had to come and walk that same exact thing. And then someone else, and then eventually the leaves and the grass and stuff started to go away and you actually started to have a path. It has to be built on. That connection has to be built on. I hope that made sense. I don't know if you've noticed too, but I use a lot of analogies because also I know that about myself. I am an analogous learner, hence my connection for remembering the word for happiness, I made an analogy to that dress. I'm an analogous learner. When people explain things to me with an analogy, then my brain goes, oh, okay. Otherwise, you're going to just say it over and over and over. And I'm going to be like, yep. But if you give me an analogy, now my brain's going to go, okay, I get that thing. So the parts of the brain that permit people to pay attention become more active during the learning process. So when they're learning, their brain, again, after you've primed it, it's going to be like, pay attention, start firing. But over a period of time, that attention, as we know, that starts to lose its firing over time. So this is why I'm actually a big fan of taking breaks, right? This is only an hour and 15 minutes. That's why we're not gonna do a break. But when I did this in person, at this point, I was like, let everybody get up, walk somewhere, talk to somebody, drink from your cup of coffee, tea, because after a certain point, the brain is going to stop firing, no matter how engaging your lesson is. I agree. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And this is from Learning Rewires the Brain. I cited all of these sources in case anybody's actually interested in going in and researching for themselves and learning a little bit more, right? This is evidence-based. So when you stop practicing or using the connections that you have made, then the trails, like I just described, the trails or the wiring disconnects. So you might have walked that trail, the student might have walked that trail over and over and over for 3 weeks in your class. But then now as a teacher, you're like, okay, now we're done with that unit. Let's move on to geometry. If you never walk that trail again, if they never walk that trail again, eventually that trail is going to disappear. Okay. However, though, it is possible for some connections to be so strong that they are never going to disconnect. So as a math teacher, my goal is to make my lessons, my content, that one. The connections are so strong that they're not going to disappear. But I know that's impossible. I just like me, right? I'm like, I know that there's tons of math that I forgot, right? Like I took business statistics in college. I don't remember any of that stuff, except I remember what my book looked like. I remember that I skipped a lot of classes because I hated it. And I remember that I barely got out of there with a B-. But any of the actual content, I don't remember, right? So those connections went away. But there are some math connections that were so strong that they have not disconnected. So I know as a teacher, I'm not going to be able to get all of the content in that bucket, but my goal is to get most of the content in that bucket. And the only way I'm going to do that is to keep walking that path, to keep having their brain to refire that. She said, hello, differential equations. Exactly. The only thing I remember about differential equations is the name, like you just said, differential equations. Okay. All right. So how do we do that, Cynthia? We get it. We got it. Good. How do I go about building those connections? So I got some tips for you. How do you build connections? 4 tips. I don't know why the third one just wasn't there, but okay. 1, you can implement transfer of learning strategies, which I'm a big fan of these. In fact, I've used 2 or 3 of them already in today's workshop. Make room for struggle. All of my math teachers, you guys knew this one already, right? We already know how important productive struggle is. Make room for struggle. To quote one of my favorite math PD people, she's actually present right now. I like push and support, right? So I'm going to push you and then I'm going to walk away because I got to give you room to struggle, right? And I'll support you when I need to, but up to a certain point, because I still got to give you room for struggle. Shout out to Patricia for push and support. Pace, repetition, and practice. Okay, so you want to make sure that you repeat and you practice it, but you also want to space it. This is important. I didn't realize how important this was until, again, I started learning this language. The app that I actually use uses what they call space repetition algorithm. It's actually an algorithm that recognizes how long it's been since I've reviewed this thing. And it gets that word, that phrase, that picture, whatever, that rule in front of me right before my brain is about to dump it, or right before my brain is about to disconnect the connection. It actually uses an algorithm. They're like, over a certain amount of time, they start to expand how far I go in between seeing that thing again. But if I got it wrong, it brings it back in. If I got it wrong, they're like, nope, you need to see it 3 days earlier. If I got it wrong again, they're like, nope, you need to see it 2 days earlier. If I get it wrong again, they're like, nope, you need to see this thing in 30 minutes, right? So spaced repetition and practice is actually another way to build those connections. And then of course, foster creativity and divergent thinking. Creativity and divergent thinking are so important, especially with math. We know our learners think that there's only one way to solve a problem, but you want to actually encourage them to think, I hate that term, outside of the box, but yes, to think outside of the box, hence divergent thinking, a different way about it, taking ownership, taking a different path. Any comments, interjections? All right, so Cindy, we're gonna get to the math stuff. We've actually been talking about math stuff, but I'm gonna get to the instructional routines. In case you never heard about transfer of learning before, here are some 5 strategies for doing transfer of learning. Explicit teaching, this one is my least favorite, just because I don't think it's super helpful, but there are some people who need this way of learning, right? These are transfer learning, and as I just said, transfer learning is one strategy, one principle that you can use to build connections, right? Transfer learning. So explicit teaching, you've also got group learning, right? A lot of us are probably big fans of that. Reflection, this one actually works for me. This one actually works for me. You're welcome, Karen. Reflection, I'm a big reflective thinker. I'm one of those people where it's just like, I kind of got what you're saying, but I'm gonna need to sleep on that. And when I wake up in the morning, then I'm probably like, I have a coworker who actually presented on brain-based learning at COABE too. I didn't even realize that we were both doing it. And I went to her session because I'm interested. Her name is Liz Elena. I'm sure you guys have heard of her, Iglesias. She's the science SME for links. And she said something that was so fascinating that has stuck with me now. She said, you have to forget to remember. And I'm like, oh, that's that thing that I was just saying, where I'm just like, I can't really get what you were talking about. It made sense. I kind of got it. I did the activity. I did the math activity. It was fun, but I was just like, but I know that I need to sleep on this a little bit, or I need to think about it more. And then tomorrow I might go, oh, I get it, because I know I'm a reflective thinker. And she actually gave science to what I know about myself thinking. She said, yes, there's actual like neurological information about what happens, that our brain at night, especially at night, dumps things. But after it dumps those things, then at night, that's when it repairs and it's like, oh, wait, no, these connections actually need to stay. And these connections actually are going to form. Hence, you need to forget to remember. And I'm like, so that's what's happening to me. Again, I now have more information about how I learn. I hope that one sticks with you all. You need to forget to remember. Analogies and metaphors, as I said, this one for me takes the cake. If you give me an analogy, I'm going to make sense of it. I'm like, oh, so this thing is like that thing? Got it. And then generalize. I also like this one too. So out of all of these transfer learning strategies, what I know about myself as a learner, the ones that work for me, generalization, analogies, and reflection. These two, not so much. In fact, this one's the least one. This one, I know a lot of people love this thing, but for me personally, I hate it when people put me in groups. I'm like, I'm going to probably learn 5%. But if you do this, or give me a chance to do this, I'm going to learn more. Okay, so any questions or thoughts about transfer learning, even if it's just something where you're like, you know what, I want to go learn more about this transfer learning thing. There are lots of books and all this other stuff out there about successful transfer learning and how to use this strategy in your classroom. All right, let's talk about the instructional routines. Because Cynthia, you said we're going to talk about stuff in the math class. We have been talking about stuff in the math class, but more concretely, right? Instructional routines. Okay, so we're going to actually think about, now that we know about thinking and learning, and we know about the different ways to learn, and we know different strategies to build connections in the learning, what kind of like instructional routines in my math class could I be leveraging, Cynthia, that are going to help with the stuff that I've just taken in? And I don't notice I want to say learn, but I was like, that doesn't mean you learned it, right? That's one of my favorite quotes that stuck with me as a teacher. Just because you taught it doesn't mean they learned it, right? You can teach to your heart's content. That doesn't mean they learn. So I'm not going to say that you learned, that we've covered today, right? So there are some instructional routines that you can use. The Adult Numeracy Network has like a web page on our website that's specifically for instructional routines. So if you ever are looking for an instructional routine and or a place to go and like actually grab something you could use in your class in the next 30 minutes, because you're teaching at 1 o'clock and you want to try a 3-act math test, that's an instructional routine. Or you want to try a contemplate then calculate, that's an instructional routine. You can actually go on our website and on that page and pull any kind of instructional routine and pull resources for that. So I said the Adult Numeracy Network, and you're probably going, well, Cynthia, are you gonna give that to us? That's what that QR code is for. So if you want to be quick, you can scan it, but don't worry. As someone already said, I already gave you my PDF of my slides. So all of these links are you already have them, right? The Adult Numeracy Network, you can go there and pull any kind of instructional routine. But just to make sure we're all aware what instructional routines are, right? Instructional routines, according to the people with their PhDs, are tasks, right, that are enacted in the classroom that structure the relationship between the teacher and the students. Consistency and high expectations. Those are the keywords there for me, right? So eventually it gets to the point where the students know exactly what the teacher expects from them and vice versa. So there's no more of like, I love this question, teacher, what do you want me to do? I'm like, no. We both know that you know what I want you to do when we do notice and wonder, right? Like that's what an instructional routine is. Instructional routines are tasks enacted in that classroom, and they provide high expectations and consistency around particular instructional interactions. Not to be confused with classroom routines, right? Like I do a warm up at the beginning of my class, Cynthia. That's not an instructional routine. That's a classroom routine. You could use an instructional routine as your warm up. One of my favorite warm up instructional routines is number of the day. Number of the day is an instructional routine, and I use that as my warm up. Or which one doesn't belong? That's an instructional routine, and I could use that as my warm up. In fact, I use which one doesn't belong as a formative assessment all the time. Here's how I know what they know by just doing this instructional routine. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so with our last 3 minutes, we're out of time. I knew that was gonna happen. Said at the beginning. I want you all to think about some of your favorite instructional routines for math and numeracy. And could you drop it in the chat, right? I named like 3 or 4, but I'd love to hear from you all. If you have any other favorites, and I'm sorry, Patricia, if I stole your push and support, you can definitely write push and support in the chat box. Amy says she does use number of the day. I would just challenge you to think outside notice and wonder. We all use notice and wonder. So now I'm going to ask you to push yourself and think about a different instructional routine. What else have you used? Could you use? And I also want you, while you're thinking about which ones you want to drop in there, with the limited time we have, this was supposed to be our connecting activity, was now that you're thinking about your favorite instructional routine, I want you to think about how that instructional routine is going to foster any of the principles for building connections, right? We know the principles are encourage creativity and divergent thinking, or use transfer of learning, or spaced and repeated repetition, right? Those 4 connections that I gave you, those 4 principles that I gave you for building connections, are there any instructional routines that are going to actually help with that? What I'm going to do is put that slide back up to help you think a little bit. Right? Where is it? Here it is. Here are our 4 principles. Use transfer of learning, make room for struggle, foster creativity, and space repetition and practice. The instructional routine that you identify that you love to do, does it foster any of these principles? Right? So I do think that which one doesn't belong? I'll use that one. I think which one doesn't belong definitely does this one, foster creativity and divergent thinking, because there is no right answer. And I would say number of the day, Amy, that one does too, because number of the day, you're allowing the students to put different representations for the quantity, the number of the day. And eventually they're going to start to get more and more creative with how they represent that number, right? The number is 17. And someone might just say 10 plus 7, but eventually you might even have someone who's like 5 times 3 minus 0 divided by 1 time, right? Like eventually you start to get more creative, right? Karen said, I don't know if this is what you mean, but my students know when they come in, they give me the work they completed at home and continue with what they didn't finish. So that would be a classroom routine, right? As I just said, that would be a classroom routine. If you want more instructional routines, I did name a few, but as I said, that website is there. And there are a number of instructional routines here, right? Notice and wonder, that's one. Number talks, I love number talks. That's an instructional routine. Number strings, I taught my teachers how to do this recently, and they were like, my students love these things. Visual patterns, remember I said that's how I learned the concept of slope, by doing visual patterns. Estimating 180, which one doesn't belong? This is one I've been saying, I really like this instructional routine. These are instructional routines. The Slowerville graph, I love this one. I'd say the Slowerville graph does really well with implementing transfer learning strategies. That's kind of what I wanted you all to start thinking about now, okay? Instructional routines that you use diligently and consistently in your math class. Now I want you to filter that through like those principles for building connections. I know that I need to make room for struggle. I know that I need to foster creativity. I know that I need space, repetition, and practice. I know I need to implement transfer of learning strategies. So if I'm trying to help them build those connections, do these instructional routines that I'm using, help with that. It's kind of what I was getting at. Okay, so we are basically out of time. I don't want to make Sarah go, Cynthia, we're out of time. So here is, again, my email address. Here's the QR code, right? So I did go ahead and share the PDF with NYACCE, but maybe you didn't see it. Maybe you're like, I don't know what they were talking about. So if you want to grab your device right now and scan this QR code is going to take you to this slide deck. And you do want the slide deck because it has all the strategies and principles that we shared, as well as, you know, all of the sources for you to actually, like, if you want to look up more about brain-based learning, I cited all the sources so you can access those sources. And you can email me if you have any questions. Thank you for sticking with me there all the way down to 12:15 and 47 seconds. And I hope this was helpful. And take it away, Sarah.